you so much, and thanks for inviting me. Really pleased to share with you where we are with this living systematic review so far. So jumping in, I'll just start with an overview of the project and how it started. Also, some relevant work that is related to the problems that we're seeing with systematic reviews, and provide some contextual factors which maybe explain some of the problems that we're seeing with systematic reviews, and finish with a few updates as a living review. I am continually updating it, and so there's been a couple of changes in this most recent iteration. So I was awarded a Career Development Award in 2019 to investigate human influences in systematic reviews, which compromise their potential reliability or validity. So obviously that's a potential conflict of interest in this presentation, because I do believe there are problems. Hopefully by the end of it, you'll see that it's not because I'm conflicted that I'm saying this, but there is plenty of evidence behind it. And the views of my own are not necessarily representative of the MRC. So despite the negative connotations of this project, I am a systematic review advocate and believe that when they're done well, they are the best way to assess evidence from multiple sources. And the purpose of this research is really to improve practice and uphold it. So as much as I enjoy Retraction Watch, the aim of this work is not to focus or humiliate individual researchers or teams or institutions. It's really to reflect on one's own practice and how we might all do systematic reviews better in the future. So systematic reviews are regarded as the gold standard in evidence synthesis, and they're used a lot in evidence-based medicine as a kind of dispassionate and objective view of the evidence base, able to give you a comprehensive and unbiased view of the evidence. But I had been working in the field of systematic reviews as a peer reviewer, as a journal editor, and as lead of an evidence review group for NICE for about 10 years, when I noticed that the reviews that were being sent to me were not particularly improving with time. I would often see whole teams of physiotherapists, psychotherapists, homeopathists reviewing their very own interventions and declaring that they had no conflicts of interest. A lot of reviews were not pre-registered or had no protocol before they were started. And then massaging data with meta-analyses is kind of a way of finding something interesting with meta-analysis. Unduly highlighting favourable studies and ignoring negative ones, and maybe adding a bit of a spin in the conclusions which didn't quite represent the full report, just to make it a little bit more interesting. And despite the guidelines and guidance that we have in systematic reviews, we're still not very good at understanding who is doing this review and why. And I think this is important to note, because a systematic review which claims to be systematic but isn't is much more misleading than just an editorial or a review, because it claims to have this level of scientific integrity which can often be absent. So when I started preparing my fellowship application and looking into the different studies finding problems with systematic reviews, I found that there were often interesting studies but published in different disciplines, in different journals, without much awareness to each other. And as I've mentioned before, there are many guidelines freely available to help people doing and conducting and publishing systematic reviews. But I really wasn't seeing much incremental improvement based on the wide availability of those guidelines. So my idea was to do a living systematic review, which would join up all those various studies published in different journals in different disciplines, and try to bring them together, thematically group them, put them in one place. And to do that, I've done a living systematic review, which has a dedicated website. And I've also published a paper on the first iteration in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So just a note on living research. I mean, a living review these days could mean simply the intention to update, but why bother with living research? I think it's useful when you have a lot of emerging data, when an area is quite fast-paced and maybe quite difficult to squash into your traditional journal publication, and where regular updates will be implemented or of use to the audience. I have took it to mean that and more. I wanted the review to be living in every sense, really, and for there to be a single point where the data would be stored and would live regardless of wherever I published it. And so to do that, I've had to develop quite a bespoke and complex infrastructure, because there are now growing software that could assist you with living systematic reviews. But at the time, because I wanted the work to be independent to any methodological body or institution, I wanted to retain that kind of academic freedom to host the data, to be sure of its integrity, and to present it exactly as I would. It was quite a painful and expensive process to develop this, but basically there is a web app and a relational database which stores all the data, and then the front end of that is the website. Attached to that is an R-Shiny app, which isn't completely live. That only has the data of the last iteration, so that needs feeding manually currently. And then obviously there's the complementary journal paper. So that's just a screenshot of what the web app looks like. It's just got a couple of papers in, and then I can click through on each of those studies, and I can complete data extraction and quality assessment in real time with collaborators. So before I started, I registered this project on the Open Science Framework. And as I began to think about the methods more and how I would do the review, I then registered it with the Prospero database, which traditionally is for health-focused systematic reviews rather than methodological projects. But my argument was that if systematic reviews are flawed, then it does have implications for health research. Actually, the living review itself, it is applicable to many disciplines and not just health. So the general inclusion criteria for the review was, I wanted to include studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals, but that were highlighting problems with published reviews as examples. And therefore, I would exclude discussion papers that would maybe talk about problems in theory with systematic reviews, but didn't apply it to any particular published examples. And I would also exclude articles which talked about the problems of meta-analyses or systematic reviews, as if they were interchangeable, if those meta-analyses were not conducted in the context of a systematic review. So the searches were difficult to design, and I had the input of 3 information specialists. Because obviously these are not discrete terms, trying to think of words for problems, limitations, flaws with systematic reviews. And roughly we had about 10,000 records to screen. And from that, in the first iteration, there were 485 different studies highlighting problems with systematic reviews. Now, one of the things that it's not really been possible to present is the prevalence of these problems, and that is because of the difference in the way that the included studies will select their samples of systematic reviews. So this plot is a scatter plot, really, and it's on a logarithmic scale because it's not possible to present the range of the number of papers that were included. But just to narratively describe, in the review, you have some studies that are highlighting many problems with one systematic review, right through to some studies which have studied tens of thousands of systematic reviews. And within that, some have looked at a consecutive sample based on the year of publication. Some have looked at a particular discipline. Some have done comprehensive searches on a particular medical area. Some have maybe looked at one journal and the systematic reviews that they published within the last 3 months. So there's a whole range of the way that people have identified these problems. Very often there are letters to the editor about the conduct of one systematic review, so that would also be included. So it's difficult to understand all the problems at once, but this is just a tree map which represents all of the problems, and those which occupy a bigger cell, they have a greater number of studies. Now, it's important to note that just because a greater number of studies have highlighted the problem, it doesn't mean that it's a more important problem. So there's a degree of publication bias, ascertainment bias, whereby people study things that they're already aware of. And so it's quite easy to be led by what their PRISMA guidelines or AmStar tells you that you should look for. And so we see those problems overrepresented. And so we will probably expect those to change. Now, just a note also, there's a degree of subjectivity in that the wording of the problems is my own wording, and that's because as an independent researcher not affiliated to any methodological body, I've had to kind of grapple with the nuances of certain things. So for instance, in Cochrane reviews, you maybe wouldn't be so bothered about quality assessment, for example. You would do a risk of bias assessment. But in order to capture the full range of these problematic systematic reviews, you want to represent the fact that some systematic reviews literally don't talk about quality at all. They will literally present just the results, and there's no risk of bias, there's no mention of quality. But then within that, there's also different levels. And then there's some people who have done quality assessment, but they've maybe done it in a flawed way, or they've used some sort of reductionist nominal scale, or they may have done risk of bias, but they've not done it according to the handbook, or they've not done it in a consistent way. So grappling with those problems has involved trying to get the synonyms right and reduce the multiplicity in terminology. But generally they fall into these 4 categories. We expect a review to be comprehensive and to find all the relevant studies. We expect it to use the best methods for the data synthesis and to be rigorous. We expect it to be reported in a way that enables others to replicate it. And we expect it to be done fairly and objectively without conflicts of interest. So just looking at those problems of comprehensiveness, and they really refer to the reviews efforts to capture the studies, and usually with the help of an information specialist. And it's in the literature searches or the decisions in inclusion criteria where studies can be omitted, or it's the decisions of the review or the lack of currency of the review and that it's out of date that may lead to it not including all the relevant studies. So rigor, that applies to the methodological conduct, and you can address that with guidelines such as Messier for Cochrane, obviously, and AmStar is a kind of retrospective guide to help you understand how well a systematic review was done. But this generally refers to whether we've got the right level of methodological expertise on the team. And then transparency is applicable usually to the PRISMA guidelines, how well it was reported and how easy it is to replicate that review. The last one is probably the least covered by existing guidelines, and it's probably the one where I had the most pushback from co-authors as well, because it does seem subjective, but in my opinion, objective is like probably one of the most critical reviews. I think that if a team have a vested interest in the review or the intervention, then it's very likely that it's going to be flawed from the outset. And even if they do attach their PRISMA checklist and appear to have adhered to good conduct, there is still a likelihood that the review is doomed if conflicts of interest are not managed. I would also say if reviews are done by teams who really don't care about the review question very much, and they don't take the pains to ensure that it's an important review question and that they're answering it in a way that measures important outcomes to patients, if they don't ensure that they have clinical expertise on the review team as well, that those are ways in which I think it compromises the scientific objectivity and it can lead to research waste. So every article was assigned a couple of keywords based on the medical speciality or the general methodological area. And so words that are larger appear more often. And as you can see, the largest words are Cochrane and general medical. So most head-to-head comparisons of Cochrane versus non-Cochrane reviews find that Cochrane reviews are superior in terms of methodological and reporting conduct, but Cochrane are also an easy target, because if you want to poke holes in systematic reviews, it's quite easy to just go to the Cochrane database and pull up a bunch of systematic reviews without doing any particularly sophisticated literature searches. General medical, the other thing that people will often do is they'll just take maybe the top 5 high impact journals and look at the systematic reviews published there. And so that's why you see these general medical speciality coming up so frequently. In other work, what we're finding is that there is a boom in systematic review production, and year on year there's more and more. And some countries are particular culprits in terms of the production of systematic reviews, and sometimes they outpace clinical research. Now, I wouldn't have even included meta-analyses in this, but this is also quite frightening. It just goes to show that despite the fact that I wouldn't consider a meta-analysis to be worthy of publishing, particularly, they're on the rise massively. In my view, a meta-analysis that hasn't been done in the context of a systematic review is just a statistical technique. It's not a research project. A systematic review, it takes time, planning, expertise, double checking, registration, revisiting, reflexivity, reflection. A meta-analysis could be done in some open source software and completed in an afternoon. It doesn't mean that it should be published. And I know that sometimes people use the term meta-analysis to be synonymous with a systematic review, but I would just say that we're not in the 90s anymore and people just need to call it a systematic review. So why is it that there are so many suboptimal systematic reviews? Well, just thinking about the context in which we, in theory, operate in, which is the statistical inquiry cycle, thinking of a hypothesis, designing the study, running the study, collecting the data, analysing, interpreting, publishing, and then thinking of the next study. Ideally, you know, that is how we would operate. But actually, when you look at the research culture of the academic community, this work from the Wellcome Trust finds that when you ask people what are the words that summarize research culture, and they're quite negative often, competitive, pressured, insecure, whereas the research culture that we would aim for and hope for would be supportive, creative, collaborative. And in my view, the reason for this is because in academia generally, publications are the currency for getting promoted, getting tenure, research contract stability. And we submit our research outputs often to journals who, not all the time, but often are quite disengaged and in the business for profit and prefer new findings, headline findings, interesting things, positivist research, and care less about the quality because they assign the job of peer review to unpaid, time poor academics to peer review. And those researchers themselves are on precarious research contracts. They've got their own research to manage. Doing a really diligent and forensic peer review probably won't be particularly valued at their recognition or assessment. And then if junior researchers are not given credit for these acts of academic citizenship, then they may not be attributed to large funding applications, and then early career researchers may disappear to other industries, leaving behind people who do know how to play the game of generating publications and naming certain people on bids, leaving behind a fairly homogeneous demographic of researchers. So that's research culture in a nutshell, but how does it affect systematic reviews? Well, I think, in my view, it's the fact that systematic reviews have this gold standard reputation for being this high level of evidence that they're almost seen as a dead cert for publication. And perhaps that is why they're being published so prolifically and often quite carelessly. And sadly, that is a cause of research waste. Research waste can be regarded as doing research but not fully making the use of the opportunity to actually speak about the body of evidence in a way that informs primary research and decision makers in a reliable and valid way. So all of that is quite negative. So just coming to think about some of the solutions just for systematic reviews in general. So I would apply those same 4 domains here. So I would be inclusive and comprehensive when it comes to including people on your systematic review team. That means ensuring have the right methodological expertise, an information specialist, a statistician, and involving members of the public to ensure that your review question has clinical meaning and uses and appraises the right outcomes, and ensuring that you have content expertise from medical specialists. Also, employing reflexivity and not assuming that you're going to be able to do all your searches at one time point, but that if you find further relevant studies that weren't identified in the first batch of searches, that you may want to look at the reasons for that and revisit the searches later on to make sure that you didn't miss any other relevant studies. So rigor and methodological conduct, Messier guidelines are really good. There's also the SWIM guidelines and many others that if you look at the website systematicrevolution.com, there are recommendations for guidelines. Don't be shocked when you find heterogeneity. Expect that the primary studies that you're including don't have exactly the same research question that you have, and try to anticipate how you're going to deal with the heterogeneity that you will find. And making sure that if you are planning any kind of meta-analysis or quantitative syntheses, that you have the appropriate statistical expertise. As a reviewer, I think it's like quite tempting to think that you ought to be an expert in everything, and you really don't need to. You just need to know the right people to ask for help, and ideally ensure that their time is costed to actually help you with this important work. Saying what you're going to do before you start to do it, and Prospero Open Science Framework is enough, or just somewhere where it is publicly accessible and ideally time-stamped. Using the reporting guidelines such as PRISMA, and publishing your research regardless of the findings, even if they don't seem particularly compelling or what you were expecting to find. And sharing your data to enable other teams of researchers to perhaps assess or reuse those findings, particularly if you are funded by a publicly funded research body. And then making sure that you have a diverse representation on the team in order to produce generalizable research, ensuring that you have people on the research team who are engaged in the research question, and making sure that you get a reliable answer. And then if you are conflicted, if you have any favoritism or feelings, optimism about the intervention, then you're just probably not the best person to be the primary investigator. And it doesn't mean that you don't have a lot to give to the review, but it's better managed by somebody who is impartial to the outcome, and that important decisions are not influenced by people who are conflicted, because people who have potential conflicts are still very useful in the review team. And just knowing when to step back, because maybe you don't have a direct conflict that would be regarded as a financial conflict, but you have one of these less acknowledged researcher allegiances, such as you have included studies in the review, or a member of your family has some sort of affiliation to the intervention, and that kind of thing. And just managing those conflicts when they are present, as they so often are in research, and accountability, because we're in an era now where you can't trust every paper that you read, and paper mills exist, and these are industries aimed at generating papers which may contain fraudulent data generated by artificial intelligence. And so you don't want to perpetuate this false data in your review. So in some ways you have to be a bit of a detective in your assessment of each new study, and making sure that you are not going to include a study, which would mean that you would have to retract your review. So what is going on? We just finished the literature searches for the last review at the end of December of last year. And so from about another 8,000 hits after full text review, we've got another 152 studies in that period. Not all are from just that period, so that also includes a few studies that were in the period prior, but we missed them for whatever reason, bringing the total number of studies up to 637, which is really quite high, and shows that this is definitely an emerging and growing area. Just a note on that, if I could speak to the research community in this, it would be great if you know, it could move on a little bit, and I guess that's the hope in this project, is that there's quite a lot of studies which show that, you know, systematic reviews do not adhere to the PRISMA guidelines or the AMSTAR guidelines, and it would be nice if we maybe looked a little bit more in depth at some of the reasons underlying or built upon different areas of work from there. One new problem identified, which is that a lack of diversity in review authorship teams from this recent batch of studies. So if you go to the objective category on the website and click on that problem, you'll see there's 4 new studies showing that, you know, some say that non-Cochrane reviews have less diversity. Some say that Cochrane reviews have less diversity on the authorship teams, and some find a correlation between a lack of diversity and then a lack of equity reporting in those reviews, which does indicate some evidence that having a homogeneous research team is not particularly good for the review output. A couple of new speciality words, but also the term living is cropping up quite a bit more now in these papers. Some good news. I would have had to put the review to bed at the end of this year, but I've managed to secure a transition support award, which means that I can keep this work going until the end of 2026, which I'm pleased about, although it does take up a lot of my time. And not only will I be updating the review, but we will be working on understanding which are the most fatal flaws out of these problems and which we should worry about the most. And final bit of news is the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology is doing a special issue on research integrity and culture, and I'm going to be a guest editor on that. So if this type of work has inspired you, or you're doing anything similar and you're thinking about publishing that, would love to see your work there. I'm really excited about that myself. And that's it from me. It was quite a whistle-stop tour, so happy to hear any questions that you might have about the work.